Is your ERP system under attack, and what can you do to mitigate risk if it is? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney for over 20 years. I have drafted and negotiated a variety of software-related contracts and litigated failed software projects in courts across the country. So let's start with the threat landscape, and I want to keep this grounded in what I actually see in my practice. And I think the first thing that I would focus on is really ransomware and malware. And most ERP environments are not going to be hacked through, some exotic 0-day in the core application. That most likely is not going to happen. They're compromised the same way that other systems are compromised, and that's through phishing email, a malicious attachment, a compromised VPN account, an unpatched server. And so once the attacker is in the ERP system, once they have the ability to get in there, backups, file shares, all of those things can be compromised. And I think those are incredibly valuable targets. If you have not protected those with encryption, redundancies, you haven't taken the right steps to mitigate the likelihood and the risk of the data security interests, you're really going to have a problem on your hands. The second thing we see is credential theft and weak authentication. ERP systems still often rely on username and password logins, sometimes with shared accounts for administrators. And if an attacker can get valid credentials through phishing, password reuse, or a contractor account that was never disabled, they're going to be able to log in legitimately, and then they can start performing fraudulent transactions, holding your data ransom, quietly infiltrating your system. The third thing we see really is misconfigurations and unpatched system. ERP landscapes are complex. There's application servers, databases, web tiers, integrations, cloud services. And I think it's very easy to end up with an unpatched component in that environment. If you've got something like that, it's going to expose you, accumulates, especially in a legacy or a heavily customized system, and it becomes harder to really protect that system from active threats. The fourth thing that we see really is insecure integrations and third-party connections. And so I think you've got to understand that a modern ERP system rarely is a standalone system. You've got APIs to a banking partner, you've got logistics partners, you've got EDI, data warehouses, now you've got AI and analytics platforms. So every one of those connections is a potential bridge, a potential vulnerability. Attackers are going to expose the weakest link in that chain, and you've got to really make sure you have protected yourself and you've taken into account those types of vulnerabilities. And then finally, what we see is insider misuse and human error. And I think, sometimes the problem really isn't an external attacker. It's an employee that has too much access. There's a contractor that, was never offboarded, or, a well-meaning user is tricked into running a malicious report or exporting sensitive data. You've got overprivileged roles and poor segregation of duties. And, all of these things are incredibly common and can be incredibly problematic. So that's the backdrop that we're dealing with. The next issue is, well, what are ERP vendors doing about this? The first theme is really cloud native security. As more ERP workloads move to cloud platforms, vendors are integrating with cloud security and monitoring capabilities. For example, you've got ERP logs and telemetry can feed into cloud solutions. The next issue is identity and access governance, and major vendors are pushing integration with enterprise identity platforms, things like SSO, MFA, conditional access, and identity governance workflows. The goal really is, to move away from local ERP user stores and towards centralized identity with strong authentication and clear lifestyle management. The third issue really is trust style access controls. And so rather than assuming that anything on a trusted network can reach your ERP, vendors are enabling more identity-centric models. The fourth issue really is platform security and resilience. And on the infrastructure side, you've got vendors learning on hardened data centers or cloud regions, pervasive encryption at rest and in transit, and standardized security baselines. And so none of this means the vendor has it covered. And I think that's a key takeaway. What it does mean is that major vendors are now providing more and better building blocks to deal with data security and data security incidents. And the question is, how do you turn those building blocks into enforceable obligations instead of just glossy marketing? I'm going to shift to how you as a customer should frame these issues in the contract that you're negotiating with your ERP vendor. And the first issue is really governance and standards. You want the vendor to commit to a documented information security program that's aligned to recognize frameworks, whatever those are for your industry, whether it's ISO, SOC, whatever it is. The second issue really is identity, access, and segregation of duties. And contractually, we're going to want to require support for enterprise single sign-on and MFA and expressly prohibit shared or generic accounts for administrative access. For vendor personnel, you want to insist on least privileged time-bound access with your approval for elevated sessions. And then, you want to think about secure configurations, patching, and change management. You're going to want commitments in that contract around patch timeliness, especially for critical vulnerabilities. For example, critical security patches, applied within a defined number of days, thinking about the high severity that patch is dealing with, and that's going to impact how fast that should be done. And then fourth, you want to think about data protection, residency, and backups. And at a minimum, what you're going to want to require encryption at rest and transit using current industry standards, secure key management. And then fifth, you're going to want to think about logging, monitoring, and visibility. And I think in the contract framework and in the negotiation, you're really going to want to insist on security relevant events being logged, logins, failed logins, role changes, configuration changes, all of that should be accounted for so that you have an understanding and some insight into what is going on. And then finally, I think this is crucial, you're going to want to have an understanding of what the customer side obligations are for you, and you want to make sure that you're going to commit to managing end user identities and roles with the tools that are provided. You're going to want to conduct periodic access reviews. You're going to want to maintain your own endpoint, email, and network security unless the vendor explicitly provides those types of controls. You're going to want to follow vendor security guidelines and supported configurations. And at the end of the day, you want a contract that allocates risks realistically. The vendor is responsible certainly for securing what they control, the service, the platform, their staff, their sub-processors, their subcontractors. But you've got to have an understanding too that you are responsible for the parts that you control, your users, your devices, your internal processes. You want to make sure that the lines of responsibility around those items are really clear in the contract. And I don't think it's unreasonable for you to take some level of responsibility for those things from a contractual standpoint. It all makes sense. What are the takeaways? How do we wrap it up? And so I think you've got to understand ERP systems are high value targets, but the risks are not really mysterious, right? The real challenge is turning generic statements about strong security into real specific enforceable contractual obligations. And if you're negotiating an ERP deal or you're reviewing one after an incident has taken place, you want to look closely at how the contract handles governance, identity and access, patching, data protection, logging, incident response, integration, and continuity. That's where you separate the marketing from meaningful protection. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about in this video, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction.